50 years ago, Boston was heading down the road to a new superhighway stretching from the South End all the way to Reedville. As more people and jobs moved to the suburbs, government officials rose to the challenge by funding more highways. But the disruption caused by highways and the advance of demolition also generated problems and resistance in the neighborhoods. The story of that resistance is told in a new book by our guest, People Before Highways, published by UMass Press. We'd like to welcome the author, Karilyn Crockett.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Great to be here.
Thank you very much for being with us.
No,
what you're writing about is before your time, but what made you so interested in this?
You know, this highway fight is an incredible story that I think many people in the city may not be aware of. I certainly wasn't. Growing up here in Boston, had a chance to do a big walk on through the South End in Roxbury one day, and had someone who was involved in a nonprofit and had been an urban planner talk to a group of young people. I was on that tour, and he talked to us about this fight to stop the highway, and we all said, "What are you talking about?" So really trying to think through what would that look like and what would that mean. At the time I was probably about 18 or 19 and had never heard the story, so was immediately captivated.
Of course, even before people in the neighborhoods got going with the resistance, there was this almost unanimous kind of groupthink among planners, government officials that, yeah, you got to build a highway.
This is the way to, this is the future. This is the way to make progress, to make cities revitalized. And it was wrong thinking, but it was not questioned at the time. Everyone thought that was the right thinking. So incredible insights from folks on the ground and residents to say, wait a minute, this is not the direction for our city, Boston or many other cities across the country that also had anti-highway fights. So an incredible victory.
And imagine there was another constituency for these highways, you know, the people with jobs in the building trades, people, some of them who grew up in the Depression, or they remember the Roosevelt programs putting people to work, so they probably thought this was a good thing too.
Absolutely. There was estimated to be about $1 billion worth of construction involved in the highway construction project, and so you can imagine absolutely unions really being behind this, saying we want to get people to work. So that was definitely on the other side of the fight, people saying, wait a minute, this is a great idea for jobs. We need jobs, we need to put people to work, and this is how we can do it. So you're exactly right to call out that other opposing side in this fight.
There was a book about this whole episode by Alan Lupo that came out in the early 70s, and what do we know now that wasn't so apparent when that book came out?
Sure. I think Alan Lupo, incredible journalist, incredible visionary in terms of trying to get this story right. I certainly stand on his shoulders in many ways to try to tell the story. What we didn't know is that folks would really be successful in stopping all these roads, and also that we would be able to affect national transportation law to create ways to fund mass transit. People didn't know what that would mean in terms of the development for the South End, for Roxbury into Jamaica Plain, in terms of the Southwest Corridor, the bike path, the new transit line, and also the developments there. So folks would not have known that in standing with Alan Lupo, but incredible to kind of look ahead and say, not only is this about transportation, which is a point that Alan Lupo got, but this is about a way to think about a new planning future for cities, for what it means to be at home, for how we conceptualize how people can live in older cities. So very visionary and very much a breakthrough that Alan Lupo absolutely got when he was writing. And
this struggle resulted in what you now explain was the first environmental impact statement in the country. I mean, that always seems to me like a template that's been used for ages, but I guess we did it here.
Right. Right, incredible, because there really had not been legislation or an approach to thinking about the environmental impact of large-scale public projects. And certainly when you're developing an interstate highway, it's going to have an impact. It's going to have an impact on people. It's going to have an impact on the environment, the built environment, the natural environment. There are lots of factors that made what was the original plan of 1948 untenable by 1969, and some of that was made possible by the Environmental Protection Act and even what the Nixon administration allowed to roll through. So this highway fight is in that moment. So the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and all these forces coalescing not only to make new legislation, but also to set new standards for what it means to create livable environments that are sustainable sustainable for communities that are there right then and now too. So very powerful legislation and laws that were in place that we benefited from.
The broad narrative in your book is the grassroots versus the technocrats, but there are some nuances too, and there are some, I guess, renegade technocrats. Talk about them.
Absolutely. So it's amazing to think about the field of urban planning as a field kind of in flux in the 20th century. And then just as you said, what does it mean to say, what are the norms? What are the norms of creating a new environment? What are the norms for creating cities that are productive, cities that are attractive to people? We have to remember that in the 20th century, particularly in the middle of the 20th century, Boston was losing population. So a lot of folks were moving out of the city, and the city was really struggling to really stabilize and grow a tax base. And so for cities like Boston, highway development and urban renewal were seen as the way to solve all of your economic problems and to build up what would be the social future of your city. So urban planners were right in the middle of that, saying, well, this is the plan you need to create, this is what you need to do. And there were some radical planners at the time that said, well, not so fast on that. And so renegades, as you say, absolutely coming in and saying, we can create powerful, modern environments that don't have to erase all the people who live there and that don't have to completely reconfigure a landscape for cars.
And of course you had Fred Salvucci, the technocrat whose grandmother was displaced for a road.
Right, absolutely. Fred Salvucci definitely tells the story about his grandmother being displaced from her home in Brighton based on the expansion of the Mass Pike. So we have these earlier fights and these earlier stories that precede the fight against the Inner Belt and I-95 that were very much politicizing people and saying, wait a minute, there had been clearance on Hudson Street for Chinatown. There had been clearance for the Mass Pike, in other areas. There had been the New York streets. There had been the West End. All these earlier battles where the city, the state, and even the federal government were truly in alignment with an expanded vision about how to remake a city. And so Fred looks at that, like many other planners that he was peers with, and says, wait a minute, that's not exactly what we need to do. In fact, that's wrong thinking. So how can we use our expertise as urban planners and architects and social scientists to use that kind of knowledge to create different kinds of plans and strategies that really are beneficial to people who are really trying to get their own foothold in terms of economic opportunity and expansion of the city.
When I was reading the book, I was reminded that this road controversy wasn't happening in isolation because you had more urban renewal going on in the South End.
Right.
By '68, you had the beginnings of Beeburg. You have racial tensions in the city.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount of disruption was colossal.
That's right. That's right. You have a city certainly in flux, trying to again figure out its future, but you're also looking at what is a change in terms of how the city is making its money. So you're in the middle of this change of a city that's moving from an industrial sort of manufacturing base to a more service-based economy that we understand now, and it's causing lots of disruption. So it's causing people to move, it's causing the city to rethink its economic strategy, it's causing us to reimagine how the city itself is physically configured to support a new economic model. So in the midst of that, you still have to ask the question, what is the path for growth, and how can we make sure that growth is benefiting the people who are here right now, as well as attracting other groups who can help populate the city. So Boston was in a very pivotal moment, and it's exactly a moment where folks are asking for more participation in planning, more participation in government. A lot of the national liberation movements are saying, wait a minute, we can be a part of this. We don't have to leave it to bureaucrats. We don't have to leave it to experts or professionals, whoever they are. We, as people who live in cities, are stakeholders here, and we deserve to have a say.
This has been a news, and we're talking about People Before Highways with the author, Karilyn Crockett. Karilyn, when it comes to disrupting people, I mean, I think if any part of the city really bore the brunt of this, it's in between the South End, Roxbury, and into Jamaica Plain. First of all, just talk about the scale of it, because you had all this demolition, all this lost housing that was going on.
Right, absolutely. So the city really begins clearance in Boston in around 1966, and so the swath of land that we look at on the Southwest Corridor that's moving from the edge of the South End through Roxbury into Jamaica Plain, there was a lot of clearance that happened there. And so if you can imagine basically around Ruggles Station or Roxbury Crossing there as a little bit of a dusty wasteland because there was this idea that a highway was coming. And for folks on the ground, it seemed unstoppable. You have alignment with, at that time, the mayor, the governor, you have federal legislation saying a highway is coming, and you have a smear of dirt on the edge of where you live. And so the feeling that it's coming, there's no stopping it, was palpable. And I think what's one of the most extraordinary aspects of the story for me is this idea that people really didn't think they could stop a highway. And I was struck by the fact that so many people that I interviewed talked about that over and over again. And I said, well, what do you mean you didn't believe you could be victorious when this organizing goes on through the 60s, 70s, 80s even? How could you stay engaged? And folks said they just wanted to believe it was possible. And so even after Sargent calls a moratorium in 1972.
That was the former governor.
Yeah, absolutely, Governor Sargent, who emerged as an incredible sort of political hero in the story. People were still worried about, okay, the highway is stopped, but what if another governor comes here? What if another sort of political leader comes in with a different mindset and decides to bring the highway back? So folks were really kind of worried, suspicious, and cautious. But the idea that they didn't think they could win is incredibly powerful and resonant for me in terms of how you think about what makes a successful social movement. This is a social movement. And to think that thousands of people came together and were effective in stopping something that they didn't think was possible is really a potent, I would say, testimony to the power of their tenacity and their desire, their resolve, even though they just really weren't sure it was possible.
What I also overlooked all these years since this was happening is how important it was to change the conversation. It wasn't just about not in my backyard, it was about why not something else instead, like the people like Chuck Turner, what the Black Panthers were doing.
Right.
Explain how that changed the chemistry.
Sure, absolutely. I think there was this overwhelming sense of dissatisfaction from with a local government and a political apparatus that was not responding to what people needed in their neighborhoods. So even conversations around urban renewal, saying, well, you have the federal government making resources available to governments to come and clear out large portions of the city and rebuild. Oftentimes these blocks or homes were not rebuilt, and urban renewal was happening at a time where there was an incredibly intense shortage of affordable housing. And so people are saying, we're not seeing the responsiveness of government in helping us to meet our needs, so we need to take matters into our own hands. So absolutely, Chuck Turner, the Black United Front, even the Boston chapter of the Black Panthers, and talking about a politics of community control, a politics of self-determination, where folks are saying, well, we have the ability to affect change in these areas, and we cannot wait for a political apparatus, local or national, to solve our problems. And so that had been a really important kernel of even civil rights, or Black power, Black nationalist thinking. And what's incredible to me is the way that approach very much informed the anti-highway movement, until folks were saying, we actually can solve this and try to take this on ourselves, even though we're not sure it's possible that we'll be successful, but we have to believe in our own devolved power as individual citizens. And so that, as a political idea, is very powerful and very transformative for what this movement was able to achieve.
We think of Frank Sargent now as a Yankee conservationalist, but before that, he was in charge of DPW for Public Works for the state.
He was a pro-highway guy.
What happened?
Yeah, and this was the question. So when President Nixon takes office, he names Volpe, who had been the governor here, his transportation guy in Washington. And so with that quick maneuver, Francis Sargent is propelled into the seat of governor. And activists who were already sort of mobilizing and coalesced at that time were saying, well, this is a pro-highway guy, but maybe there's a way we can talk to him or convince him to reconsider this pro-highway position. And so folks saw that as an opportunity. perhaps appealing to his work and commitment as an outdoorsman, as a fisherman, as someone who definitely enjoyed the natural environment, and folks tried to really convince him and talk to him about the fact that the highway itself was absolutely going to threaten the built and natural environment. And so 1969, he takes office, and advocates immediately work to get in his ear. Even just a few days after his inauguration, show up a couple thousand people on the steps of the State House protesting, saying, "You're here now, you need to talk to us." And to his credit, he spent some time talking to people and saying, well, what is the issue? What is this highway project, and why are you so upset about it? And that starts a dialogue, actually, which actually leads to him coming around and saying, well, you know what? We were wrong. And that's literally what he announces on broadcast news, that we are wrong and we need to change course. An incredible story for people to understand that they were able to not only change the policy, but change the governor's mind and work with his staff to come to a different political position.
Well, if you fast forward to around 1987, the L on Washington Street comes down, there's a new orange line depressed, and you got
Right.
parkland on either side, which was a vast improvement.
Yeah.
But, as this was being planned, a lot of people in the neighborhoods are saying, I don't know about parkland, they might get vandalized or something.
It's
I mean,
true.
to talk about winning people over and making it work.
Yeah, absolutely, and amazing to think about. So if you take it from Sargent's decision, sort of early 70s, 1972, the moment where the decision is made that we're going to stop this road. We're going to stop the inner belt, we're going to stop the development of the Southwest Corridor Highway, and we are going to move toward thinking about a more holistic plan of not only transit development, but of a parkland. And at this time in the 70s, people were not particularly open or warmed up to the notion of a park. This is a time where people were still questioning the safety of parks, the safety of cities. There was quite some suspicion there on the part of people who even lived in cities. And David Lee is the person who really comes up with this idea of Southwest Corridor Park. Is celebrated architect in the city, now still working at Stellan Lee, but at the time he says, when he came up with the idea of a corridor park, people were sort of questioning him and saying, are you sure about this? I don't think this is a good idea at all, which again, for me is sort of astounding when we think about how beautiful the Southwest Corridor Park is, 4.7 miles, bike lanes and tot lots and gardens, and it's an incredibly important part of the urban fabric of the city. But to think that there was a moment where this was sort of dismissed as something that would not be helpful, would not be welcome, would not be well used, and would be the subject of vandalism.
I should mention, Karilyn, if people want to track down the book, there's some way they can Google this and make it come up?
Sure, absolutely. I'm happy to say that our local independent bookstore, the Frugal Bookstore in Roxbury, is carrying this book, and a couple other independent booksellers around. I think it's at the Brookline Booksmith is there as well, and folks can certainly Google it and grab it off of Amazon too. So it's great that it's available, and people have been really helpful in just trying to make sure it's stocked locally, which is terrific.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Karilyn Crockett, and the book is People Before Highways.